7 The supplement of origin thus understood. What is supplementary is in reality difference, the operation of differing which at one and the same time both fissures and retards presence, submitting it simultaneously to primordial division and delay. Difference is to be conceived prior to the separation between differing as delay and differing as the active work of difference. Of course this is inconceivable if one begins on the basis of consciousness, that is, presence, or on the basis of its simple contrary, absence or non-consciousness. It is also inconceivable as the mere homogeneous complication of a diagram or line of time, as a complex succession. The supplementary difference vicariously stands in for presence due to its primordial self-deficiency. Going through the first investigation, we must try to ascertain how far these concepts respect the relations between signs in general, indicative as well as expressive, and presence in general. When we say through Husserl's text, we mean a reading that can be neither simple commentary nor simple interpretation. Let us note first that this concept of primordial supplementation not only implies non-plenitude of presence, or, in Husserl's language, the non-fulfillment of an intuition, it designates this function of substitutive supplementation, supplenes, in general, the in the place of, virtuous, structure which belongs to every sign in general. We were surprised, above, that Husserl did not submit the possibility of this structure to any critical questioning, that he assumed it as a matter of course when he distinguished between indicative and expressive signs. What we would ultimately like to draw attention to is that the for itself of self-presence, traditionally determined in its dative dimension as phenomenological self-giving, whether reflexive or pre-reflexive, arises in the role of supplement as primordial substitution, in the form in the place of, virtuous, that is, as we have seen, in the very operation of significance in general. The for itself would be an in the place of itself, put for itself, instead of itself. The strange structure of the supplement appears here, by delayed reaction, a possibility produces that to which it is said to be added on. This structure of supplementation is quite complex. As a supplement, the signifier does not represent first and simply the absent signified. Rather, it is substituted for another signifier, for another type of signifier that maintains another relation with the deficient presence, one more highly valued by virtue of the play of difference. It is more highly valued because the play of difference is the movement of idealization and because, the more ideal the signifier is, the more it augments the power to repeat presence, the more it keeps, reserves, and capitalizes on its sense. Thus an indication is not merely a substitute that makes up for, supply, the absence or invisibility of the indicated term. The latter, it will be remembered, is always an existent and indicative sign also replaces another kind of signifier, an expressive sign, a signifier whose signified, be due to, is ideal. In real communicative speech, expression gives way to indication because, we saw, the sense aimed at by the other and, more generally, his experience are not presented to me in person and never can be. This is why Husserl says that, in such cases, expression functions like indication. It now remains to be seen, and this is most important, in what respect expression itself implies, in its very structure, a non-plenitude. It is known as being more full than indication, since the presentational data is no longer necessary here, and since it can function as such in the alleged self-presence of solitary speech. It is important to see how from a distance, an articulated distance, an intuitionistic theory of knowledge determines the Husserl's conception of language. The whole originality of this conception lies in the fact that its ultimate subjection to intuitionism does not oppress what might be called the freedom of language, the candor of speech, even if it is false and contradictory. One can speak without knowing. And against the whole philosophical tradition Husserl shows that in that case speech is still genuinely speech, provided it obeys certain rules which do not immediately figure as rules for knowledge. Pure logical grammar, pure formal semantic theory, must tell us a priori on what conditions speech can be speech, even where it makes no knowledge possible. We must here consider the last exclusion, or reduction, to which Husserl invites us, so as to isolate the specific purity of expression. It is the most audacious one. It consists in putting out of play, as non-essential components of expression, the acts of intuitive cognition which fulfill meaning. We know that the act of meaning, the act that confers be due tongue's intention, is always the aim of a relation with an object. But it is enough that this intention animates the body of a signifier for speech to take place. The fulfillment of the aim by an intuition is not indispensable. It belongs to the original structure of expression to be able to dispense with the full presence of the object aimed at by intuition. Once again evoking the confusion that arises from the intertwining, Verflichtung, of relations, Husserl writes in the first investigation, 9, if we seek a foothold in pure description, the concrete phenomenon of the sense-informed, synebulleton, expression breaks up, on the one hand, into the physical phenomenon forming the physical side of the expression, and, on the other hand, into the acts which give it meaning and possibly also intuitive fullness 9 in which its relation to an expressed object is constituted. In virtue of such acts, the expression is more than a merely sounded word. It means something, and insofar as it means something, it relates to what is objective, e.t., p. 280.1 fullness therefore is only contingent. The absence of the object aimed at does not compromise the meaning, does not reduce the expression to its unanimated, and in itself meaningless, physical side. This objective somewhat, i.e., what was meant or intended, can either be actually present, through accompanying intuitions, or may at least appear in representation, for example, in a mental image, and where this happens the relation to an object is realized. Alternatively this need not occur, the expression functions significantly, fundies in vol, it remains more than mere sound of words, but it lacks any basic intuition that will give it its object, e.t., p. 280. The fulfilling intuition therefore is not essential to expression, to what is aimed at by the meaning. The latter part of this chapter is wholly devoted to accumulating proofs of this difference between intention and intuition. Because they were blind in this respect, all the classical theories of language were unable to avoid acarias or absurdities to which Husserl locates along the way. In the course of subtle and decisive analyses, which we cannot follow up here, he demonstrates the ideality of be due to and the non-coincidence between the expression, the be due to, both as ideal unities, and the object. Two identical expressions may have the same be due to, may mean the same thing, and yet have different objects. For example, the two propositions, Bucephalus is a horse and this steed is a horse. Two different expressions may have different be due tangent but refer to the same object. For example, the two expressions, the victor at Jena and the vanquished at Waterloo. Finally, two different expressions may have the same be due to and the same object, London, Londres, Zweer, to, duo, etc. Without such distinctions, no pure logical grammar would be possible. The possibility of a theory of the pure forms of judgments, which supports the entire structure of the formal and transcendental logic, would be blocked. We know that pure logical grammar depends entirely on the distinction between widersinnig and Sinnlosigkeit. If it obeys certain rules, an expression may be widersinnig, contradictory, false, absurd according to a certain kind of absurdity, without ceasing to have an intelligible sense that permits normal speech to occur, without becoming nonsense, unsinn. It may have no possible object for empirical reasons, a golden mountain, or for a priori reasons, a square circle, without ceasing to have an intelligible sense, without being sin loss. The absence of an object, Gegenstandslosigkeit, is hence not the absence of meaning, Bedeutungslosigkeit. Pure logical grammar, then, excludes from normal discourse only what is nonsense in the sense of unsinn, abracadabra green is where. If we were not able to understand what a square circle or golden mountain means, how could we come to a conclusion about the absence of a possible object for such expressions? It is this modicum of comprehension that is denied us in the unsinn, in the ungrammaticalness of nonsense. Following the logic and necessity of these distinctions, we might be tempted to maintain not only that meaning does not imply the intuition of the object but that it essentially excludes it. What is structurally original about meaning would be the Gegenstandslosigkeit, the absence of any object given to intuition. In the full presence that comes to fill the meaning's aim, intuition and intention are melted together, forming an intimately blended unity, eine Geschmolzeneinheit, of an original character. This is to say that the language that speaks in the presence of its object effaces its own originality or lets it melt away, the structure peculiar to language alone, which allows it to function entirely by itself when its intention is cut off from intuition, here dissolves. Here, instead of suspecting that Husserl began his analysis and dissociation too soon, we could ask if he does not unify them too much and too soon. Are not two possibilities excluded from the start, namely, that the unity of intuition and intention can never be homogeneous at all and that meaning can be fused into intuition without disappearing? And are they not excluded for reasons that are essential and structural, reasons that Husserl himself has adduced? To take up Husserl's language, are we not in principle excluded from ever cashing in the draft made on intuition in expression? Let us consider the extreme case of a statement about perception. Let us suppose that it is produced at the very moment of the perceptual intuition. I say, I see a particular person by the window while I really do see him. It is structurally implied in my performance that the content of this expression is ideal and that its unity is not impaired by the absence of perception here and now. For whoever hears this proposition, whether he is next to me or infinitely removed in space and time, should, by right, understand what I mean to say. Since this possibility is constitutive of the possibility of speech, it should structure the very act of him who speaks while perceiving. My non-perception, my non-intuition, my height and absence are expressed by that very thing that I say, by that which I say and because I say it. This structure will never form an intimately blended unity with intuition. The absence of intuition, and therefore of the subject of the intuition, is not only tolerated by speech, it is required by the general structure of signification, when considered in itself. It is radically requisite, the total absence of the subject and object of a statement, the death of the writer and / or the disappearance of the objects he was able to describe, does not prevent a text from meaning something. On the contrary, this possibility gives birth to meaning as such, gives it out to be heard and read. Let us go further. How is writing, the common name for signs which function despite the total absence of the subject because of, beyond, his death, involved in the very act of signification in general and, in particular, in what is called living speech? How does writing inaugurate and complete idealization when it itself is neither real nor ideal? And why, finally, are death, idealization, repetition, and signification intelligible, as pure possibilities, only on the basis of one and the same openness? This time let us take the example of the personal pronoun I. Husserl classes it among essentially occasional expressions. It shares this character with a whole conceptually unified group of possible meanings, Bedeutung, in whose case it is essential, each time, to orient actual meaning, Bedeutung, to the occasion, the speaker and the situation, 26, et. p. 315. This group is to be distinguished both from the group of expressions whose multiplicity of meanings is contingent and reducible by a convention. The word rule, for example, means both a wooden instrument and a prescription, and from the group of objective expressions where the circumstances of the utterance, the context, and the situation of the speaking subject do not affect their univocal meaning. For example, all expressions in theory, expressions out of which the principles and theorems, the proofs and theories of the abstract sciences are made up, et. p. 315. Mathematical expression would be the model for such expressions. Objective expressions alone are absolutely pure expressions, free from all indicative contamination. An essentially occasional expression is recognizable in that it cannot in principle be replaced in speech by a permanent objective conceptual representation without distorting the meaning, Bedeutung, of the statement. If, for example, I try to substitute, for the word I as it appears in a statement, what I take to be its objective conceptual content, whatever speaker is designating himself, I would end up in absurdities. Instead of I am pleased I would have whatever speaker is now designating himself is pleased. Whenever such a substitution distorts the statement, we have to do with an essentially subjective and occasional expression which functions indicatively. Indication thus enters into speech whenever a reference to the subject's situation is not reducible, wherever this subject's situation is designated by a personal pronoun, a demonstrative pronoun, or a subjective adverb such as here, there, above, below, now, yesterday, tomorrow, before, after, etc. This massive return of indication into expression forces Husserl to conclude, an essentially indicating character naturally spreads to all expressions which include these and similar presentations as parts. This includes all the manifold speech forms where the speaker gives normal expression to something concerning himself, or which is thought of in relation to himself. All expressions for percepts, beliefs, doubts, wishes, fears, commands belong here. 26, et. p. 318. We quickly see that the root of all these expressions is to be found in the 0 point of the subjective origin, the I, the here, the now. The meaning, Bedeutung, of these expressions is carried off into indication whenever it animates real intended speech for someone else. But Husserl seems to think that this Bedeutung, as a relationship with the object, I, here, now, is realized for the one Ivo is speaking. Asterisk in solitary speech the meaning of T is essentially realized in the immediate idea of one's own personality, et. p. 316. Is this certain? Even supposing that such an immediate representation is possible and actually given, does not the appearance of the word I in solitary speech, a supplement whose raison d'etre is not clear if immediate representation is possible, already function as an ideality? Doesn't it give itself out as capable of remaining the same for an I here now in general, keeping its sense even if my empirical presence is eliminated or radically modified? When I say / even in solitary speech, can I give my statement meaning without implying, there is always, the possible absence of the object of speech, in this case, myself? When I tell myself I am this expression, like any other according to Husserl, has the status of speech only if it is intelligible in the absence of its object, in the absence of intuitive presence, here, in the absence of myself. Moreover, it is in this way that the ergo sum is introduced into the philosophical tradition and that a discourse about the transcendental ego is possible. Whether or not I have a present intuition of myself, I expresses something, whether or not I am alive, / am means something / here also the fulfilling intuition is not an essential component of expression. Whether or not the I functions in solitary speech, with or without the self-presence of the speaking subject, it is symbol. And there is no need to know who is speaking in order to understand or even utter it. Once again the border seems less certain between solitary speech and communication, between the reality and the representation of speech. Does not Husserl contradict the difference he established between Gegenstandsziehkeit and Bedeutungslosigkeit when he writes, the word T names a different person from case to case, and does so by way of an ever-altering meaning, Bedeutung? Does not speech and the ideal nature of every Bedeutung exclude the possibility that a Bedeutung is ever-altering? Does not Husserl contradict what he has asserted about the independence of the intention and fulfilling intuition when he writes, what its meaning, Bedeutung, that of the word 40, is at the moment can be gleaned only from the living utterance and from the intuitive circumstances which surround it? If we read this word without knowing who wrote it, it is perhaps not meaningless, Bedeutungslos, but is at least estranged from its normal meaning, Bedeutung, et. p. 315. Husserl's premises should sanction our saying exactly the contrary. Just as I need not perceive in order to understand a statement about perception, so there is no need to intuit the object I in order to understand the word I. The possibility of this non-intuition constitutes the Bedeutung as such, the normal Bedeutung as such. When the word J appears, the ideality of its Bedeutung, inasmuch as it is distinct from its object, puts us in what Husserl describes as an abnormal situation, just as if / were written by someone unknown. This alone enables us to account for the fact that we understand the word I not only when its author is unknown but when he is quite fictitious. And when he is dead. The ideality of the Bedeutung here has by virtue of its structure the value of a testament. And just as the import of a statement about perception did not depend on there being actual or even possible perception, so also the signifying function of the I does not depend on the life of the speaking subject. Whether or not perception accompanies the statement about perception, whether or not life as self-presence accompanies the uttering of the I, is quite indifferent with regard to the functioning of meaning. My death is structurally necessary to the pronouncing of the I. That I am also alive and certain about it figures as something that comes over and above the appearance of the meaning. And this structure is operative, it retains its original efficiency, even when I say I am alive at the very moment when, if such a thing is possible, I have a full and actual intuition of it. The Bedeutung I am alive or my living present is what it is, has the ideal identity proper to all Bedeutung, only if it is not impaired by falsity, that is, if I can be dead at the moment when it is functioning. No doubt it will be different from the Bedeutung I am dead but not necessarily from the fact that I am dead. The statement I am alive is accompanied by my being dead, and its possibility requires the possibility that I be dead, and conversely. This is not an extraordinary tale by Poe but the ordinary story of language. Earlier we reached the I am mortal from the I am, here we understand the I am out of the I am dead. The anonymity of the written I, the impropriety of the I am writing, is, contrary to what Husserl says, the normal situation. The autonomy of meaning with regard to intuitive cognition, what Husserl established and we earlier called the freedom or candor, frank parler, of language, has its norm in writing and in the relationship with death. This writing cannot be added to speech because, from the moment speech awakens, this writing has duplicated it by animating it. Here indication neither degrades nor diverts expression, it dictates it. We draw this conclusion, then, from the idea of a pure logical grammar, from the sharp distinction between the meaning intention, Bedeutungsintention, which can always function emptily and its eventual fulfillment by the intuition of the object. This conclusion is again reinforced by the supplementary distinction, equally sharp, between fulfillment by sense and the fulfillment by the object. The former does not necessarily demand the latter, and one could draw the same lesson from an attentive reading of 14, content as object, content as fulfilling sense, and content as sense or meaning implicit. From the same premises, why does Husserl refuse to draw these conclusions? It is because the theme of full presence, the intuitionistic imperative, and the project of knowledge continue to command, at a distance, we said, the whole of the description. Husserl describes, and in one and the same movement effaces, the emancipation of speech as non-knowing. The originality of meaning as a name is limited by the telos of vision. To be radical, the difference that separates intention from intuition would nonetheless have to be provisional. And yet this provision would constitute the essence of meaning. The eidos is determined in depth by the telos. The symbol always points to, fate seen of as, truth, it is itself constituted as a lack of truth. If possibility or truth is lacking, an assertion's intention can only be carried out symbolically, it cannot derive any fullness from intuition or from the categorial functions performed on the latter, in which fullness its value for knowledge consists. It then lacks, as one says, a true a genuine meaning, Bedeutung, 11, et. pp 285-86. In other words, the genuine and true meaning is the will to say the truth. This subtle shift incorporates the eidos into the telos, and language into knowledge. A speech could well be in conformity with its essence as speech when it was false, it nonetheless attains its entelechy when it is true. One can well speak in saying the circle is square, one speaks well, however, in saying that it is not. There is already sense in the first proposition, but we would be wrong to conclude from this that sense does not wait upon truth. It does not await truth as expecting it, it only precedes truth as its anticipation. In truth, the telos which announces the fulfillment, promised for later has already and beforehand opened up sense as a relation with the object. This is what is meant by the concept of normality each time it occurs in Husserl's description. The norm is knowledge, the intuition that is adequate to its object, the evidence that is not only distinct but also clear. It is the full presence of sense to a consciousness that is itself self-present in the fullness of its life, its living present. Thus, without disregarding the rigor and boldness of pure logical grammar, without forgetting the advantages it has over the classical projects of rational grammar, we must clearly recognize that its formality is limited. We could say as much about the pure morphology of judgments, which, in the formal and transcendental logic, determines pure logical grammar or pure morphology of significations. The purification of the formal is guided by a concept of sense which is itself determined on the basis of a relation with an object. Form is always the form of a sense, and sense opens up only in the knowing intentionality relating to an object. Form is but the emptiness and pure intention of this intentionality. Perhaps no project of pure grammar can escape this object-related intentionality. Perhaps the telos of knowing rationality is the irreducible origin of the idea of pure grammar, and perhaps the semantic theme, empty as it is, always limits the formalist project. In any case, transcendental intuitionism still weighs very heavily upon the formalist theme in Husserl. Apparently independent from fulfilling intuitions, the pure forms of signification, as empty or cancelled sense, are always governed by the epistemological criterion of the relation with objects. The difference between the circle is square and green is where or abracadabra, and Husserl links up these last two examples somewhat hastily. He is perhaps not attentive enough to their difference, is that the form of the relation with an object and of a unitary intuition appears only in the first example. Here this aim will always be disappointed, yet this proposition makes sense only because another content, put in this form, S is P, would be able to let us know and see an object. The circle is square asterisk asterisk, an expression that has sense, symbol, has no possible object, but it makes sense only insofar as its grammatical form tolerates the possibility of a relation with the object. The efficiency and the form of signs that do not obey these rules, that is, that do not promise any knowledge, can be determined as nonsense, unseen, only if one has antecedently, and according to the most traditional philosophical move, defined sense in general on the basis of truth as objectivity. Otherwise we would have to relegate to absolute nonsense all poetic language that transgresses the laws of this grammar of cognition and is irreducible to it. In the forms of non-discursive signification, music, non-literary arts generally, as well as in utterances such as abracadabra or green is where there are modes of sense which do not point to any possible objects. Husserl would not deny the signifying force of such formations, he would simply refuse them the formal quality of being expressions endowed with sense, that is, of being logical, in the sense that they have a relation with an object. All of which amounts to recognizing an initial limitation of sense to knowledge, of logos to objectivity, of language to reason. We have experienced the systematic interdependence of the concepts of sense, ideality, objectivity, truth, intuition, perception, and expression. Their common matrix is being as presence, the absolute proximity of self-identity, the psing in front of the object available for repetition, the maintenance of the temporal present, whose ideal form is the self-presence of transcendental life, whose ideal identity allows idealiter of infinite repetition. The living present, a concept that cannot be broken down into a subject and an attribute, is thus the conceptual foundation of phenomenology as metaphysics. While everything that is purely thought in this concept is thereby determined as ideality, the living present is nevertheless in fact, really, effectively, etc., deferred ad infinitum. This difference is the difference between the ideal and the non-ideal. Indeed, this is a proposition which could already have been verified at the start of the logical investigations, from the point of view we are advancing. Thus, after having proposed an essential distinction between objective expressions and essentially subjective expressions, Husserl shows that absolute ideality can only be on the side of objective expressions. There is nothing surprising in that. But he immediately adds that, even in essentially subjective expressions, the fluctuation is not in the objective content of the expression, the be due to, but only in the act of meaning, be due ten. This allows him to conclude, apparently against his former demonstration, that, in a subjective expression, the content may always be replaced by an objective and therefore ideal content, only the act then is lost for ideality. But this substitution, which, let us note in passing, would again confirm what we said about the play of life and death in the I, is ideal. As the ideal is always thought by Husserl in the form of an idea in the Kantian sense, this substitution of ideality for non-identity, of objectivity for non-objectivity, is infinitely deferred. Assigning a subjective origin to fluctuation, and contesting the theory which claims it would belong to the objective content of be due to and so impair its ideality, Husserl writes, we shall have to look on such a notion as invalid. The content meant by the subjective expression, with sense oriented to the occasion, is an ideal unit of meaning, be due to, in precisely the same sense as the content of a fixed expression. This is shown by the fact that, ideally speaking, each subjective expression is replaceable by an objective expression which will preserve the identity of each momentary meaning, be due to, intention. We shall have to concede that such replacement is not only impracticable, for reasons of complexity, but that it cannot in the vast majority of cases, be carried out at all, will, in fact, never be so capable. Clearly, in fact, to say that each subjective expression could be replaced by an objective expression, is no more than to assert the unbounded range, Schrankenlosigkeit, of objective reason. Everything that is, can be known in itself. Its being is a being definite in content, and documented in such and such truths in themselves. But what is objectively quite definite, must permit objective determination, and what permits objective determination, must, ideally speaking, permit expression through wholly determinate word meanings, be due tungen. We are infinitely removed from this ideal. Strike out the essentially occasional expressions from one's language, try to describe any subjective experience in an ambiguous, objectively fixed fashion, such an attempt is always plainly vain. 28, et. pp 321-22, italics added, asterisk these theses concerning the unambiguous objective expression as an inaccessible ideal will be taken up again in the origin of geometry in a literally identical form. In its ideal value, then, the whole system of essential distinctions asterisk is a purely teleological structure. By the same token, the possibility of distinguishing between the sign and the non-sign, linguistic sign and non-linguistic sign, expression and indication, ideality and non-ideality, subject and object, grammaticalness and non-grammaticalness, pure grammaticalness and empirical grammaticalness, pure general grammaticalness and pure logical grammaticalness, intention and intuition, etc., is deferred ad infinitum. Thus these essential distinctions are caught up in the following aporia, de facto and realiter they are never respected, and Husserl recognizes this. De jure and idealiter they vanish, since, as distinctions, they live only from the difference between fact and right, reality and ideality. Their possibility is their impossibility. But how can we conceive this difference? What does ad infinitum mean here? What does presence mean, taken as difference ad infinitum? What does the life of the living present mean as difference ad infinitum? That Husserl always thought of infinity as an idea in the Kantian sense, as the indefiniteness of an ad infinitum leads one to believe that he never derived difference from the fullness of a parousia, from the full presence of a positive infinite, that he never believed in the accomplishment of an absolute knowledge as the self-adjacent presence of an infinite concept in logos. What he shows us of the movement of temporalization leaves no room for doubt on this subject, although he had not made a theme of articulation of the diacritical work of difference in the constitution of sense and signs, he at bottom recognized its necessity. And yet, the whole phenomenological discourse is, we have sufficiently seen, caught up within the schema of a metaphysics of presence which relentlessly exhausts itself in trying to make difference derivative. Within this schema Hegelianism seems to be more radical, especially at the point where it makes clear that the positive infinite must be thought through, which is possible only if it thinks itself, in order that the indefiniteness of difference appear as such. Hegel's critique of Kant would no doubt also hold against Husserl. But this appearing of the ideal as an infinite difference can only be produced within a relationship with death in general. Only a relation to my death could make the infinite differing of presence appear. By the same token, compared to the ideality of the positive infinite, this relation to my death becomes an accident of empirical finitude. The appearing of the infinite difference is itself finite. Consequently, difference, which does not occur outside this relation, becomes the finitude of life as an essential relation with oneself and one's death. The infinite difference is finite. It can therefore no longer be conceived within the opposition of finiteness and infinity, absence and presence, negation and affirmation. In this sense, within the metaphysics of presence, within philosophy as knowledge of the presence of the object, as the being before oneself of knowledge in consciousness, we believe, quite simply and literally, in absolute knowledge as the closure if not the end of history. And we believe that such a closure has taken place. The history of being as presence, as self-presence in absolute knowledge, as consciousness of self in the infinity of Parausia, this history is closed. The history of presence is closed, for history has never meant anything but the presentation, Gijanwatigang, of being, the production and recollection of beings in presence, as knowledge and mastery. Since absolute self-presence in consciousness is the infinite vocation of full presence, the achievement of absolute knowledge is the end of the infinite, which could only be the unity of the concept, logos, and consciousness in a voice without difference. The history of metaphysics therefore can be expressed as the unfolding of the structure or schema of an absolute will to hear oneself speak. This history is closed when this infinite absolute appears to itself as its own death. A voice without difference, a voice without writing, is at once absolutely alive and absolutely dead. As for what begins then, beyond absolute knowledge, unheard of thoughts are required, sought for across the memory of old signs. As long as we ask if the concept of differing should be conceived on the basis of presence or antecedent to it, it remains one of these old signs, enjoining us to continue indefinitely to question presence within the closure of knowledge. It must indeed be so understood, but also understood differently. It is to be heard in the openness of an unheard of question that opens neither upon knowledge nor upon some non-knowledge which is a knowledge to come. In the openness of this question we no longer know. This does not mean that we know nothing but that we are beyond absolute knowledge, and its ethical, aesthetic, or religious system, approaching that on the basis of which its closure is announced and decided. Such a question will legitimately be understood as meaning nothing, as no longer belonging to the system of meaning. Thus we no longer know whether what was always presented as a derived and modified representation of simple presentation, as supplement sign writing or trace forward / asterisk is not, in a necessarily, but newly, a historical sense, older than presence and the system of truth, older than history. Or again, whether it is older than sense and the senses, older than the primordial thought or intuition, older than the present and full perception of the thing itself, older than seeing, hearing, and touching, even prior to the distinction between their sensible literalness and their metaphorical elaboration staged throughout the history of philosophy. We therefore no longer know whether what has always been reduced and abased as an accident, modification, and return, under the old names of sign and representation has not repressed that which related truth to its own death as it related it to its origin. We no longer know whether the force of the Gijanwatigang, in which the Gijanwatigang is represented so as to be represented as such, whether the repetitive force of the living present, which is represented in a supplement, because it has never been present to itself, or whether what we call with the old names of force and difference is not more ancient than what is primordial. In order to conceive of this age, in order to speak about it, we will have to have other names than those of sign or representation. New names indeed will have to be used if we are to conceive as normal and pre-primordial what Husserl believed he could isolate as a particular and accidental experience, something dependent and secondary, that is, the indefinite drift of signs, as errance and change of scene, verwandlung, linking representations, vergegeniutigungen, one to another without beginning or end. There never was any perception, and presentation is a representation of the representation that yearns for itself therein as for its own birth or its death. Everything has, no doubt, begun in the following way. A name on being mentioned reminds us of the Dresden Gallery. We wander through the rooms. A painting by Teniers represents a gallery of paintings. The paintings of this gallery would represent in their turn paintings, which on their part exhibited readable inscriptions and so forth. Ideas I.O.O. E.T. p. 293, modified. Certainly nothing has preceded this situation. Assuredly nothing will suspend it. It is not comprehended, as Husserl would want it, by intuitions or presentations. Of the broad daylight of presence, outside the gallery, no perception is given us or assuredly promised us. The gallery is the labyrinth which includes in itself its own exits. We have never come upon it as upon a particular case of experience, that which Husserl believes he is describing. It remains, then, for us to speak, to make our voices resonate throughout the corridors in order to make up for, suppeler, the break-up of presence. The phoneme, the akamum, is the phenomenon of the labyrinth. This is the case with the phone. Rising toward the sun of presence, it is the way of Icarus. And contrary to what phenomenology, which is always phenomenology of perception, has tried to make us believe, contrary to what our desire cannot fail to be tempted into believing, the thing itself always escapes. Contrary to the assurance that Husserl gives us a little further on, MTHE look cannot abide.